Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The top story we are tracking this evening. China's grip on rare earth magnets has left the global auto industry in a bind. The Chinese government has imposed export restrictions on the magnets due to national security concerns. Importers will now have to provide an end-use certificate to ensure that the magnets are not being used for making weapons, without this end-user certificate, China will not export the magnets. They will also have to provide assurance that there will be no transfer to a third party. So why does China have an edge when it comes to rare earth magnets? Let's take a look. China accounts for around 70% of the total mining of rare earth metals and holds nearly 90% of the global production. The impact on Indian auto industry is estimated to be quite severe and steep. The industry's annual demand for rare earth magnets stands at around 850 tons. The total import cost would be around 310 crore rupees. So the cost is not much, but why are these magnets so important? Well, rare earth magnets are 10 times stronger than conventional magnets. They help maintain performance at high temperatures and have a longer lifespan as well. These magnets are largely used in components that are essential in manufacturing both ICE and electric vehicles. Without these magnets, it will be impossible for companies to produce components and production could come to a halt. And this includes components such as e-axle, speedometers, crankshaft sensors, ignition coil, electric water pump as well. So what are the next steps the government will have to take? In the short term, the centre will have to engage with China to fast-track approvals and seek exemptions from end-use certificates. In the medium term, the government will have to look at partnering with other nations, including Australia and Vietnam, along with building a domestic supply chain. Lastly, in the long term, the government will have to consider a PLI-like scheme for self-reliance and provide financial incentives to large companies. And all of this is essential to make sure we can manufacture rare earth magnets in India. We're now joined by Geoff Pyatt, Senior Managing Director for Energy and Critical Minerals at McLarty Associates. He was also the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources. Mr. Pyatt, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Let me begin by asking you, Trump and Xi Jinping have had a phone call. Donald Trump has said that this was a successful phone conversations where they also discussed rare earth metals. Do you think if Trump and Xi Jinping have a breakthrough in those trade tensions, then globally, China would give a reprieve to everyone on the rare earth magnet issue?
Parikshit, good evening. It's good to be with you. I think there's certainly the possibility of a short-term understanding as part of the broader US-China trade negotiations. But I don't think that changes the message to all of us from this Chinese export control. What's happened in the past few weeks reminds me very much of May of 22, when I was US ambassador in Greece and Gazprom began to restrict sales to the European Union, starting with Bulgaria. It's a wake-up call, demonstrating that China is not a reliable supplier. So what we need to do is exactly what you suggested in your intro segment, which is to develop the alternative supply chains, to make the investments required to bring the processing back to our countries, back to reliable suppliers, and to work together as the United States, as India, in the Quad perhaps, in order to build the alternative supply chains that will provide the greater volumes of these materials we're going to need for our energy transition, but in a way that doesn't jeopardize the security of our economies.
Right. Ambassador, when it comes to China, China not only dominates rare earth resources, but also the processing of it in China itself. Could you give us a sense of to what extent does China control the rare earth supply chain, not just in Southeast Asia, but also in countries all the way into Africa, into Brazil?
So 2 points. First of all, rare earths are not exactly rare. They are called rare earths because the materials are difficult to separate, but the geological resource is widely dispersed. Brazil, for instance, has substantial rare earths resources. We have the same here in the United States. And it's important to remember also, Parikshit, that while it's auto supply that's getting the headlines right now, these magnets are used across our economies importantly for India and the United States in defense applications like F-35 aircraft. They are essential to wind turbines, like the turbines that GE Vernova is building there in Pune, where I visited about a year ago. They also are in every one of our cell phones. The vibration motors that when you put your phone on silent mode, those use rare earth magnets. So these are materials that are pervasive to our modern digitized economy. Because we weren't paying attention, for the better part of 2 decades, we allowed China to achieve a near monopoly in the processing of these magnets. But we are beginning to develop diversification. I was in Brazil last year in Minas Gerais, where the state government has a national rare earths processing industry. Ironically, Brazil is a major producer. Most of their rare earth clays are exported to China and then come back in the form of industrial imports. Likewise, in the United States, we have MP Materials, a company which is mining rare earths in the United States. Until very recently, MP Materials was exporting for processing in China, but now they're accelerating their plans to develop a national processing supply chain. That's exactly what we need to do. We need to do it working together. For instance, we have the example in India of Epsilon Materials in Bombay, which has developed a national supply chain for graphite anode material for batteries, another material that on which China has placed export controls. So we know how to do this. What we have to do is work together to develop the alternatives.
Right. Ambassador, what I'd also like to ask you, and you said this in a previous interview, that US has 1.3% to 1.4% of rare earth reserves globally. India has quadruple of these reserves. Now, from your experience and understanding, you were someone who in the State Department was dedicatedly looking at this issue. Weaponization of critical rare earths, critical minerals. How soon can India, if we get onto this in a mission mode, how soon can India set up at least a domestic supply chain for assembly, processing and recycling of used rare earth magnets?
So I mentioned earlier, Parikshit, the example with Russian gas. And if you look at what happened to Europe in 2022, there was short-term disruption, just as there's short-term disruption right now in auto industries because of these Chinese magnet controls. But what came out at the end was a more sustainable and more secure situation. I'm very proud of the fact that when I was in government, I led the effort to bring India into the Mineral Security Partnership, something that was announced when Prime Minister Modi and President Biden had their state visit 2 years ago in summer of 2023. And that has created a framework for our governments to work together. I was deeply impressed by the partnership, the work that we did together with Secretary Mines, K.L. Kantha Rao, and the effort that the Ministry of Mines has been making to identify the opportunities that you described in your intro, looking at the PLI process, looking at the capacities of Indian industry, whether it's Tata Materials or what's happening in the auto industry itself. I remember 2 years ago when I was in Bombay, I had the opportunity to catch up with my friend Anand Mahindra. And then I traveled to Pune to see what Mahindra Autos is doing with its EV manufacturing, which is deeply impressive. But we all became complacent about some of the upstream inputs. And China has now demonstrated a willingness to exploit that complacency in order to weaponize its monopoly control. So the answer is not to negotiate a new agreement with China. The answer is to develop diverse and reliable supply chains. And that's going to be easier if we're working together to mobilize our resources. For instance, the geological resources that India enjoys in its territory, but also the capacity of Indian and American industry to work together. For instance, in East Africa, a region where Indian industry has a very strong presence, or in Southeast Asia. And I mentioned earlier the Quad, where we have a good example already of cooperation between Japan and Australia through Linus Rare Earths, an initiative of those two governments, after China placed controls on Japan's rare earth supply chain. But we should be taking that example and projecting it out into the political construct that the Quad provides for our four countries.
Right. Those are very strong long-term recommendations that you're making, Ambassador, and we're glad to hear that. But, you know, in the short term, there is a worry. We've been speaking to electric vehicle manufacturers in India like Bajaj Auto, TVS Motor Company, and they've gone on to the extent of saying that you'll bring the industry to a halt because you cannot manufacture electric vehicle motors, other ICE equipment without these rare earth magnets. The only supplier right now is China. We can't diversify so quickly. In the short run, what can we do to secure our supply chains to make sure our manufacturing does not get affected?
So first of all, we have to negotiate smartly and collectively because, yes, we are dependent on China, but China is dependent on us because their industry cannot absorb all of their output. So you have significant Chinese firms that are going to be lacking in a market if the government does not relax these controls. That's why I said I'm confident that we can find a pathway for some kind of a negotiated solution over the short term. But we need to be smart about it and not allow a situation where we all say, well, that was unpleasant, but let's go back to being dependent on a sole source of supply. We need to invest in alternatives. Right. That's exactly what we've been doing with the Mineral Security Partnership in the Biden administration. And I'm glad to say India was one of the Biden administration's strongest partners in understanding the imperative of developing the alternative supply chains that we have the capacity to accomplish. This is a financial problem. Right. It's not an innovation problem. Our companies know how to do this. We just need to build the market and the supply chain so that we don't find ourselves in a position where China can use its resource control as a sword hanging over our throats.
Right. Ambassador, what's your worry for U.S. manufacturing, U.S. electronics majors, electric car companies like Tesla, for that matter, or even Ford? How do you think, how badly would they be impacted because of these restrictions on rare earth magnets?
Well, Parikshit, just like in India, this is front page in the business sections right now. There was a long Wall Street Journal article yesterday reporting on some of the discussions among our big Detroit auto manufacturers. The Wall Street Journal reported that Ford has already slowed down production of one of their large electric vehicle models. The reporting has also pointed to efforts both to identify alternative supplies where possible. That is to say, using less powerful, less durable magnets. But if you do that, you're going to have a less competitive product. And that's why we have to make the investments in alternative supplies. If you look at what MP Materials is doing in the United States, they are scaling up their alternative supply chain very rapidly, but they have an exclusive supply agreement right now with General Motors. That was struck several years ago. In retrospect, it looks like a very forward-looking move by both companies because they recognized that this was a key vulnerability in the EV supply chain. And again, I want to emphasize something that I'm sure officials in South Block are also focused on. This is not just an auto industry question. And in particular, it has implications for our defense industry because of the application of these magnets, in particular in areas like electromagnetic sensors and fifth generation fighters like the F-35. So this is a national security challenge as well. And we need to meet it in that spirit.
Right. You're absolutely right. This is not just a manufacturing issue or a supply chain issue. It is a national security and almost a war-like scenario, because if you weaponize supply chains around critical minerals, around semiconductors, around rare earth magnets, this is in a way a war, so to say. Having said that, the big worry right now, Ambassador, in the industry here is what if China puts similar restrictions on lithium batteries? that would also cripple the automotive industry, not just in India, but worldwide as well. What do you think India and US can do right now? Do you think Trump administration is critically looking at this issue with the Indian government under the compact framework? Recently, we saw Vikram Misri, the foreign secretary, visiting the United States. This was one of the key issues on the table. Do you feel that this is something that is getting a lot of attention from the Trump administration vis-a-vis India?
It certainly is getting attention vis-a-vis the Trump administration, but it's also an issue of wide concern and bipartisan concern in our Congress. And what I would highlight, Parikshit, is that we have more than 2 years of history of India and the United States collaborating closely on these issues. This was a huge part every time I visited New Delhi, precisely because of the expectation we had at the time that China was going to continue to leverage its controls over these vital inputs to the clean energy economy. So I mentioned already the example of Epsilon Materials. In the solar space, of course, the two largest investments in the world by our Development Finance Corporation, with Tata Renewables in Tamil Nadu and First Solar. We need to take exactly the same approach on batteries, on anode material, on other key clean tech inputs like hydrogen electrolyzers. You have the example of Greenco in Hyderabad, which is working in this area. India is on the right path with its PLI scheme, and recognizing that government needs to play a role in putting in place the incentives that will reshore some of these key inputs. And we're having a debate in our US Congress this very week over the same issues for our Inflation Reduction Act, which you can think of as an American version of the PLI scheme.
All right, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us with that comprehensive perspective on where the problem lies with regard to rare earth magnets, how critical this is for India and the United States to work together, not just to negotiate a short-term solution with China, but also for looking at long-term supply chain resilience around that. We're taking a short break, but don't go anywhere. China's stranglehold over supply of rare earth magnets has caused concerns among Indian auto companies. A special discussion with Puneet Gupta of S&P Global Mobility on the other side. Stay tuned.